All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Gain up to 26 times Salesforce deployment efficiency using Strongpoint. My name is Scott Daniel. I'm the Director of Marketing at Strongpoint. We appreciate all of you taking the time today to join. This is the first in a series of webinars Strongpoint will be hosting in 2019. But before we get started, I will very quickly run through a couple housekeeping items, and then we can dive right into it. We have a lot to cover. Today's webinar is being recorded. All lines are muted. We will conduct a Q&A at the end of the discussion. So please use the question function at the bottom right corner of your panel to ask any questions. This function is going to be available throughout the webinar, so please submit all questions anytime throughout the webinar. Don't forget it. Just go ahead and submit it, and we're going to get to as many as we can. We're excited about today's webinar, one that is based upon a side-by-side competition that revealed shocking results. We will review the comparison, the hows, the whys, and also have a deep dive panel discussion along with demos interspersed throughout, followed by a Q&A, all submitted by you. So let me take a minute to introduce the panel. First, we have John Knight. John is a seasoned Salesforce admin and a trailblazer. John is the one that conducted the comparison, which is the anchor for today's conversation. He has been an Salesforce admin at companies of various sizes, and the company where he conducted this comparison is a mid-sized health tech company. Second, we have Janelle Garner. Janelle was a declarative developer at Salesforce and is also a trailblazer and a veteran Salesforce admin. She too has worked for companies of all sizes, most notably for one of the largest telecommunications in the world, and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to our panel discussion. Janelle now works for Strongpoint. And if that's not enough, we have added a third distinguished guest to our panel, one who has an unusual pedigree, Rob Brown. Rob has been very active with Salesforce for a long time, active in many capacities as an admin, a developer, a consultant, and he's also worked for Salesforce, helping their largest customers be successful. As you can tell, we have a very full agenda. I believe one that will be educational, informative, thought-provoking, and entertaining. So let's get rolling. I will hand the mic over to Rob. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it, and I see a lot of familiar faces out there. Super excited to be with everybody today, and super excited to have John and Janelle here with us. The reason that we put this together was just to have all of our prospects and customers be able to talk to folks that have actually done work with Strongpoint in the field. And so I'm going to go ahead and let John and Janelle take over. John, can you talk to us a little bit about why you guys did the benchmark, you and Ben did the benchmark, and a little bit about the methodology and the approach that you used?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Rob. Definitely excited to talk about the benchmark that I did, because that was kind of the moment that really got me sold on Strongpoint as a tool that transforms an admin's world using Salesforce. This was pretty early on in my exposure to Strongpoint, and it was kind of actually an accidental comparison, because it was one of those days that was high pressure for an admin. We were doing this deployment, and we needed this very big set of components moved from one environment to another, and was told it absolutely had to be done that day. This change set that I was building was over 1,000 components, and it was a staging change set that was, felt like it should have been really simple, because it was just object fields, page layouts to get some staging infrastructure in for the rest of the app that was going later. And I was really struggling with a change set, because as many admins are familiar, the change set interface allows you to click through just like 25 components at a time. You select a few, add them to your change set, and then you rinse and repeat. When you're adding 1,000 components, that's extremely painful. As a matter of fact, it was about 4 hours of pain that I went that route. And at the end of putting together that change set 4 hours, it didn't even pass because I had missed some things and I had to go back through again. And so it was at that point I was like, we've got this product Strongpoint that I haven't actually used that much yet, and why aren't I taking a look at that? And so I ended up switching over my focus to Strongpoint and seeing how can I build this change set in Strongpoint. Because previously what we had done was kind of, we had halfway adopted Strongpoint. You know, we had started building a change set in the normal change set interface, and then we would move it over through Strongpoint, import it into Strongpoint, and move it over to get the policy and compliance. But I had the mindset shift that I would actually take it start to finish in Strongpoint. And what I found, just looking through the interface of building the component, it was exactly what you would expect it to be for putting together a change set, where I could search by an object and pull in all those fields for the object. Like Janelle's showing on the screen here, searching by the parent object, and then you can also select the metadata type, whether you're looking to add page layouts or validation rules or fields. And then once you've selected just the parent object that you're looking for and select the metadata type, you can just do a shift click to select, or control click and select the ones you want. In my case, since it was a new infrastructure build out, we were selecting all of them and just add all of them for that object in one step. And so that piece alone transformed the way I was building the change set and pulling in the customizations. Once I had, so that pulled a 4-hour process of clicking through change set pages just down into a matter of minutes. But then on top of that, that's where I was like, okay, so this is dramatically different. Let's finish, you know, testing the comparison, because I had already started 2 parallel tracks. So what I ended up doing was actually deploying, or trying to deploy, I should say, through the change set and through Strongpoint at the same time. And because of the way Strongpoint deploys through the API, it was in the new environment in less than 30 minutes. So start to finish, I had added all the objects, added the fields, added the page layouts, and pushed it from one environment to the other. The sandbox on the other side, on the other hand, like, I still continued doing that. And by that point, it was just a mental exercise of curiosity, because Strongpoint already had it deployed. But we uploaded that change set into the new environment, and it actually took overnight before that large change set showed up as an inbound change set. And I reached out to Salesforce, asking them, like, why did this take so long? And what I learned was that when you're deploying a change set through the native functionality, you actually get put in a queue. And there's several factors that impact your speed, such as how many other Salesforce customers are deploying change sets at that particular time, but also what's the impact of your change set, so that if you have a very big one, you get put in the slow queue, which was apparently the case for my scenarios, that I got my big change set put in the slow queue behind other Salesforce customers. And, you know, I really have the mindset that, you know, it's my environment, I've got the connection to both, I should be able to move from one to another when I want to, and have a good interface on top of that. So that was my experience that really got me sold on Strongpoint as a platform, just how much faster moving that big 1,000+ component change set went. But I know, you know, I was talking with Janelle, and there's a whole lot of process, business and technical, before even getting to that point of having a list of 1,000 components to deploy. And so Janelle, you know, I know what I talked about actually wasn't what got you sold on the platform. You were really engaged with all of the time saving of the process before you even get to what I just talked about. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story.
So John, real quick.
Absolutely, John, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, before we get into the whole sort of life cycle, software development life cycle aspect of it, in terms of what it actually saved for you just in the deployment process, you went from 13 hours down to about a half hour.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That's the biggie, right? It's so just in sort of the final phase of deployment, we saw a 26x increase in productivity, and I know that Janelle's going to talk a little bit about all the productivity gains that come before that, but that was really what prompted you to reach out to us and talk about this particular subject.
Yeah, and my experience working through that was really good because going into that deployment, I had sort of a my way of doing it mindset. And going in, the question I was asking was, how can Strongpoint help me do this deployment my way? And there were some ways that Strongpoint could. But coming out of it, my question was, how can Strongpoint transform the way I'm doing this from the inside out to make it a better experience? And so that was really neat to see just an entirely different approach that made the whole experience so much better and removed the pain points I was trying to mitigate altogether.
That's outstanding. Appreciate it. So Janelle.
So when I heard 26 times faster, I thought, that number, I was confused how we got to it, and talking to John, I got a better idea of talking about actually the process of moving metadata through the different environments. Which was awesome, and I wish that had been the pain point that I encountered. What I encountered at multiple locations, and most recently at my last position at a major telecom company, is just getting to the point of being able to say, yes, I can do something in the system, was a very, very long process. The most common example that always seems to come up is, what does it take to delete a field? And I couldn't answer that. And unfortunately, the developers I worked with couldn't answer that. Our Scrum Master couldn't answer that. No one seemed to know the answer to that because Salesforce has so much information in it that when I found out that there was a tool that could do all the research that I was doing by hand, and when I say all the research, I joke about, spreadsheet mania and trying to do all of this legwork to feel confident that what we're doing is safe and not going to break anything. We clocked it at over 275 hours of my life have gone to building spreadsheets to prevent me breaking a Salesforce system.
So when we talk about that, we talk about some of the research that goes into risk assessment, and we talk about some of the methodology behind impact analysis and just the collaboration.
And that's just logged for the preventative research. That's not even the standard change management lifecycle. That was in between research projects that were dedicated to just identifying what are the risk factors around an object, and logging just those was over 275 hours of my life.
So great, yeah. So
when I saw
when you talk about that, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on not only the spreadsheet aspect of it, but the collaboration aspect of it, talking to people, emails, approvals, getting people in the same room, in the same mindset, in the same place, that sort of thing.
Well, it was great when I had the spreadsheets up and ready to go. It usually was a lot faster to bring this to the developer and say, okay, I want to delete this field. I ran through the research project I just did and confirmed that it's not being used by workflow rules, validation rules, process builders. Like, I can check it off on all of that, but now I need you to confirm it's not in Apex. And that was always kind of the sticking point, is that they had a couple ways to do it, but none of them really seemed that fun. And it always seemed to add a week or two to the cycle. So if I wanted to delete a field today, I needed to budget probably 1 to 2 sprint cycles or a month or two to really be able to do that. And that was very, very frustrating because I wasn't just trying to delete one field. My role as a declarative developer has always been to innovate someone's entire experience. So if it takes that much to change one field, imagine trying to move 500 components and making sure that they don't break anything. And invariably, I'd end up in meeting after meeting with architects, developers, and everyone trying to show them I didn't break anything. The research aspect tend to make it go a little bit faster, but it didn't ever guarantee it. So on an average week, 8 to 10 hours of my time were coordinating emails, identifying the research I did, demonstrating that what I'm doing is going to be safe for the system. And honestly, at the end, I think it just always boiled down to, when it comes to Salesforce, we try and manage risk by looking at what I tried to change, but nothing is really safe to change because it all ties together so nicely. So changing that field could have massive impact or it could have no impact, and there was no way to know that up front.
So
the time we spent trying to prevent that risk is huge.
Maybe you can show us just in a manual manner how you could use Strongpoint to do manual risk assessment or impact analysis by using the DRD.
So the DRD, okay, can pull up the DRD. So the DRD is really cool. This is the first thing that really got me excited about Strongpoint, and I know why John likes it, and I've gotten lost in here as well. Is the DRD allows you to have kind of a visual representation of how everything is tied together in the system. And the best part of this isn't me updating this, the system is automatically updating this for me. So as we're tying information together, it's showing us where it's being used. So where the account ID field is being used, and building these relationships as we go through so that we can truly get a really, really good idea of what's connected. Now, in case you're like me and you went, okay, the DRD is awesome, I could definitely use this to cut down my research time because it would just tell me. Strongpoint offered something even beyond that. And that is, right now they have process issues, which are looking at the customizations you selected and telling you what it would take in the system to safely change it.
So in the spectrum of what it would take, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on simple versus complex changes and what that means to you as a declarative developer.
As a declarative developer, it would mean that I can have established processes behind what it takes to do something. So if I want to change a report that is, a standard system, it hasn't been tagged by any other teams as impacting a dashboard or a homepage or anything, we can have that set to something as simple as log changes only, which is I just acknowledge I did it. However, if I wanted to do something like change maintenance type on account, which happens to be referenced in Apex, this is telling me that I have to make sure that I push this through actual testing and the full cycle because it will have other impacts. And as a declarative developer, it means that instead of thinking about changes in terms of that metadata, what is it? Is it a field? Is it a report? Is it a process builder? Is it a workflow rule? I don't have to worry about that part. Strongpoint is going to pull it apart and tell me what customizations it touches, so what other things that field could touch in Apex or reports or dashboards, and say if it's safe or not. So when I go to ask for permission to make a change, or say I'm going to make a change, anyone can look at it and tell me from the beginning how risky it is, and we can all be on the same page at the same time. So we don't have to look at it in terms of, is it code or not code? Is it a field? Is it a page layout? We have a system that breaks it all down and tells you exactly what everything will touch. And I can just send a link and have someone look at it and say, yes, everything is in order. All of these things are signed off. You can modify this. We're sure it's not going to break any of these things. We know exactly where everything is, and the system's going to update for me. So all of my spreadsheets become, obsolete in 20 seconds.
So a couple of questions. Number one, John, I would ask for your input, but number two, before we do that, Janelle, can you talk a little bit about how many spreadsheets you actually had to assemble, and maybe even how many fields within those, or how many rows within those spreadsheets you had to ferret through, and then maybe we can talk a little bit to John and see how he uses the DRD and the process issues and the change request objects.
So from a spreadsheet standpoint, I know I had at least 87, most of them, and that's at least. This is the last 3 years that I actually started paying attention to how much time I spent on it. But most of the spreadsheets had at least 5 to 6 tabs of, 100 to 200 rows, with the biggest having as much as 5,000 rows per tab on the spreadsheet with 5 to 6 tabs.
86 spreadsheets. So there's a couple of huge implications there. Number one, you're dropping a whole bunch of data out of the system. You're manually manipulating that data outside of the system, which isn't probably the most secure approach to this. And number two, just the amount of labor, effort, and time to create those spreadsheets and ferret through them is got to be overwhelming. And obviously you've sort of quantified that you were spending 8 to 10 hours a week just building spreadsheets. Once those spreadsheets were created and built, how did you leverage the spreadsheets to kind of collaborate with your stakeholders? You know, the people that have to make approvals, the people that have to look at the analysis, the people that have to collaborate with you.
Well, I mean, I want to say that I built the spreadsheets and I put them in a shared location, and all of my teammates were amazing and they updated it all the time, and the spreadsheets were always up to date. I wish I could say that, but we all know I can't. What it eventually, I think, came down to is using the spreadsheets. I would have filters and formulas and combinations to make it easier to find data and how it related to each other. But at the end of the day, I think those spreadsheets really just let me trust that if Janelle's going to do that much work, we trust her to take into consideration everything we want to do versus them actually wanting to dig into the spreadsheets with me. And, you know, kind of be sure. Instead, it was just kind of like, okay, well, we trust Janelle. She's more than willing to do the legwork.
So that's a great point as well. I mean, that's really a fantastic point. If you think about that, you did a lot of analysis, pull a lot of data in the spreadsheets, and at the end of the day, you're human, I'm human, we're all human. And no matter how much data you dropped into a spreadsheet, number one, it was latent, so it was a little bit behind it. But number two, how would you know that you had all the information that you absolutely needed to ensure that your decisions were absolutely correct?
Honestly, at the end of the day, I always hope that I did enough. You know, I will say I had a pretty decent track record of not breaking stuff, but there was never certainty.
Right. So, and that's the interesting thing.
Just
because,
better odds.
Right. And that's the interesting thing. When we think about this, we're really, at the end of the day, we're just human. And so at the end of the day, this is just an opinion rather than a fact. And so, you know, when we actually hit the button to deploy, I think of Yosemite Sam sticking his fingers in his ears and clenching his eyes closed and just wondering, oh my goodness, is this really going to work? John, can you talk a little bit about your experience and how much faith you had in making decisions before you used Strongpoint versus making decisions to make changes after?
Yeah, I mean, I think apart from Strongpoint, I've seen and participated in what I like to call the bad way and the painful way. The bad way is hit deploy and see what happens. And you do some educated guesswork beforehand. And I can't say I ever did anything quite as thorough as Janelle putting together tiers of spreadsheets with components. But doing, you know, basic review of related object workflows and processes. But then as an admin, you still are taking a guess at what might be embedded in code somewhere. And then there's also the painful way of using some sort of IDE to pull a complete code dump and using your Control F find. I wonder where the field is in my however many lines of code I have.
Right, I was going to ask you, I mean, how many times do you resort back to Control F and just look for a script using an IDE, and how often do you absolutely trust that approach or that method?
I've seen that approach go wrong in the past few weeks with one environment, and I don't trust that approach. You know, it sounds good in theory to have all of your code, and if you just identify everywhere the field is used, but the reality is that you're not going to read code on the same speed that you're going to navigate through the DRDs, so you still have to balance your time investment and your thoroughness looking through that approach, even if theoretically in those thousands of lines of code you have all the answers right in front of you.
So that's an interesting thing. I know you and Ben are big proponents of the DRD. How much do you use the DRD versus the automated risk assessment or sort of application level approach? Is it something that you just sort of fall back on? Is it something that you sort of employ into your daily routine, or how do you use it?
For me, I really like it as a go-to. It's so easy that I can't think of any reason you don't start there when even if it's like a casual conversation of, you're talking to a sales manager and, oh, we're starting this new marketing campaign and we're going to have this new lead source come in. And so could you just add a lead source to a pick list? And even if they come by your desk and they're standing there and you're like, you know what, let me take 2 minutes to give you an idea of what the level of effort is going to be on that. Oh, you know what, I see it's actually referenced in a couple of Apex Visualforce pages here and in this class. So our developer's going to have to update this page we use in this portal, and we're going to have to update the class to make sure the testing works correctly. And so to be able to have that kind of answer within 2 minutes before we're even talking about any formal change request or any of the risk analysis, I find to be really helpful.
So that's actually an interesting point, because really what you're doing is you're saying a lot of things. You're saying, number one, that it builds your credibility with your user base because you can give them an answer immediately. Number two, you're kind of talking about a manual approach to what Strongpoint does from an automated perspective behind the scenes. But number three, at the end of the day, can you talk a little bit about when you have a nominated change how quick can you get that nominated change into production versus what it used to take before Strongpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. I think the key is knowing upfront how long it's going to take and spending the right amount of time on it, because what I've seen a lot is not even a matter of how fast can I do this, but a matter of what's the right amount of time to spend doing this so that I am doing the quick things quickly and I'm doing the complex things more diligently. So instead of having a 2-week approval process where it gets put in a queue and gets reviewed and the whole team analyzes it for impact and you have a dev review if there may be some code involved, and at the end of the day you find out there's no code and you could have just updated the pick list, that scenario, it speeds it way up.
How frustrating is that when you find out that you could have just put a nominated change in production immediately?
That's the kind of thing that is so annoying that I almost pretend it doesn't happen, because if I tell users that I could have done this 2 weeks ago, then that's just not a good experience for the rest of the business. When something takes 2 weeks, that could have just been 2 minutes or 2 hours. But equally,
I think the worst part
of it.
Yeah, I know you have.
I think the worst part
I was going to ask you.
Well, when we're talking about updating a pick list and knowing that it's not being used anywhere, I would say that 2 weeks would have been nice. I had to hedge it and say 1 to 2 months.
1 to 2 months.
And there was nothing more painful. 1 to 2 months to do something as simple as adding a value to a pick list.
So maybe you can
And
help.
that was, I always wanted to hope that it would be faster, but it usually wasn't.
So maybe you can help everybody on the call understand why it would take 1 to 2 months in an environment like you had at a large telco. Just the bureaucracy, the overhead, maybe talk a little bit about that.
I think the hardest part was just the inability to distinguish how large a change would be. We do our standard sprint reviews and our cycles, and we want to scope how large something is. But even if I scope something as being very, very small and not risky to the system, we still wanted to push it through this huge involved process to, have it go into different environments. It needed to be tested by multiple people. Once it was tested, it needed to go to an environment and be tested again, that it was available, and that it could only be released at certain times. So it had to go through basically what you would expect a large Apex class to go through for an additional pick list value. Or on the other hand, you could always, risk it and try and sneak it in and hope you didn't get yelled at.
So there's a couple of implications there. Implication number one is that small changes that should be made on the fly obviously never sort of get the level of attention that the large changes do. So there's kind of an implication that small changes that would really enhance the user experience on a day-to-day basis just wind up falling through the cracks. And so the only changes that really get made are the large complex changes, which which are great. And you talked about this a little bit yesterday. I mean, sort of changes fall into two classes for you, kind of, large development changes, and then there's sort of the day-to-day changes. And and you talked a lot about yeah, exactly. And you talked a lot about the nuances between them, but my personal experience, the reason that users love the system is because you can adapt it on the fly. But when you start to get into a large environment and you're not making those nuanced changes on a regular basis, users start to get frustrated, and they start to go outside the system. They start to use spreadsheets. They start to attrit and just abandon the whole system itself. And so there's a huge impact there.
So I have to give John credit for that for the analogy he put in, paralysis through analysis.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think
John coined that one. And
so John,
well, I can't take credit for coining it. It's a very common phrase in sales I've seen, that people would analyze something to the point of taking no action. And I think it applies equally well to working as an admin, where especially, you reference, you put it in there and you get yelled at, you do that one too many times, and now you're not going to touch anything until you've analyzed it to death. And at the end of the day, you end up not making the change that's needed in a timely fashion, if at all. And so that's where Strongpoint gives you the confidence of seeing everything it impacts and knowing if you need to go involve your dev, if you need to just spend a couple hours looking through process builders and making sure those are going to still work correctly, or if you don't. And instead of spending that time and going to your dev every time because you need to analyze it completely, you can give it the right amount of attention.
And I do think there was another side to that where we seem to move things on the perception of risk, not on the actual amount of risk. So it's perceived that changing an Apex class is risky, but John, you can probably also agree that if it's a test class, the risk is dramatically mitigated, and changing a report is not risky. But if it's a report that an executive looks at daily, it actually is risky. So the perception of a report isn't dangerous isn't accurate.
So you have something huge.
That's actually key, Janelle, because report change of field that shows up on a report sounds very simple. But actually in our environment, we had a handful of reports that were tagged, labeled, categorized as KPI reports. And these reports were ones that our president and COO looked at on a regular basis and was using as business operating reports. So it was very impactful. You did not want to touch anything that would change those reports without his understanding, approval, and blessing, even if it's just a pick list field on why a customer is leaving or where a lead came from. Those were key things that he cared about that were just pick list values that showed up on a report. But having that understanding of actual risk, where the actual risk could be very high, but the perceived risk of just changing a pick list value could be very low.
So that's a huge thing. When we talk about the faith that users have in their admins, and the faith and trust and confidence that that the user community has, we tend to think about technical risk as being a barrier to making changes, but there's a huge amount of organizational risk, and when you can address that with a tool set, how does that enhance the confidence of your users, and how does that bolster the relationship between the user and the admin?
Well, it really transformed it. I think for me, a lot of it is that sort of example scenario I gave where a sales manager walks by your desk. I find that one of the biggest things I can do to bolster confidence in the user base for our Salesforce org is to understand timelines and be able to stick to them. It does not bolster confidence to say, oh yeah, that's a simple pick list value. That's just a text field value. I can make that change by tomorrow, no big deal. And then go back tomorrow and say, well, actually, ... And we found that it's touches this, breaks that, and it's a much better experience and builds confidence if you can say, hey, I see it touches these 3 things. We're going to need to work it into our next sprint cycle. It's probably going to be 3 weeks, even though that might not be the answer they want to hear. It builds the confidence that you understand the environment.
Yeah.
You know what you're doing, and you're going to deliver on what you're doing, because that's what they care about at the end of the day.
Yep, and it bolsters the confidence that they don't need to go and build a spreadsheet to do it, or go outside the system, and so that whole user experience becomes better, and the risk of attrition is mitigated. And I think we're in the midst of a really good discussion, but I can see that we've got a huge queue of questions. So Scott, I would ask at this point that we can start to involve some of our attendees and start to address some of the questions. I see Ben's got 3 or 4. Abby's got a couple of questions. Wondered if we could start queuing up some of those questions and throw them out to John and Janelle.
Absolutely. And by the way, please feel free to add additional questions. It's just simply type it in the question box, and we're going to try to get through as many as possible. I'm going to go through them as they come in, so don't be shy. Ben asked, have you considered a GitHub integration, a process to allow us to update our code in GitHub after we make deployments?
So is that a question?
I can't speak for the I can't speak for the product team, but I can say we have customers that use Git.
So the answer to that, from a product perspective, me being the product guy and putting me on the spot here, Ben, I appreciate it. Yeah, that is going to be rolled out in the next 180 days. 2 releases out, actually.
Perfect. Okay. Again, just going straight down the line, is there a way to turn off certain dependent reviews? We have 12,000 reports, so something like a mount would list almost all of the reports. We'd like to take that one.
Yeah. So we've got Mark here, Mark Walker, and he can start addressing some of the technical questions.
Hey, so yeah, so there's two parts to answer that question. It's a great question. The first one is that we're rolling out automated report cleanup to help solve the reason why you have 12,000 reports. When we do analysis with our customers, the vast majority of them are, I don't know, 10% of those reports are valuable. And so by cleaning them up, we can actually make that much less impactful, because you obviously don't want to be doing impact analysis against reports that are not being used. There's also a way of, in the impact analysis, filtering out anything that has a date last used more than 6 months ago. So even if the reports are there, you can ignore them. And you can ignore them in the DRD, and the system will automatically ignore them in impact analysis.
Excellent. Okay, does the DRD work well with external objects?
Does the DRD work well with external objects? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So the DRD works incredibly stably in both. With MuleSoft, for example. Yeah, so with the first of all, the DRD works very stably in both traditional and Lightning implementations. And with our new MuleSoft and Celigo and soon Boomi and other iPaaS vendor integrations, you will have automatic visibility into external dependencies as well. And that would mean that you can not only tell that changes to Salesforce are going to break Salesforce, you can tell the changes to Salesforce are going to break, another application that you've integrated with Salesforce, which is, in today's environment, absolutely critical. So MuleSoft integration comes out into beta tomorrow, and then Boomi, Talend, Jitterbit, and a number of other integrations will be coming out progressively over the next 3 months.
Excellent. We had mentioned previously that something about risk analysis of a deployment, is there some type of metric that uses to quantify the riskiness, or is the risk analysis done manually by going through DRD?
Oh, that's a great question, right? So the risk analysis, there's multiple different types of risk analysis going on all the time. So the first thing is that whether or not you ever ask it to, Strongpoint is making a decision about the riskiness of changing an object all the time. And what it's mixing into that are standard things that are standard across all Salesforce orgs, such as obviously object dependencies and the directionality of those dependencies. So it's obviously things that are already scripted are more risky to change than things that aren't already scripted. It's also looking at things like organizational risk and externality dependencies. So for example, if you have objects in a managed package, Strongpoint will immediately recognize that those are much riskier to change because the change may not be stable. So all of that risk analysis is being done, and that surfaces the impact analysis in the risk explanations that are written in plain English right next to the objects. We don't just show you the objects, we show you the risk right here, so it's giving you the examples. But that's also put into the score. So when you actually do a process issue, which I think, which I remember that John was talking about earlier, that process issue surfaces, when it surfaces full software development lifecycle, that's a blend of two different things. Strongpoint's inherent judgment of the risk based on the technical and organizational dependencies, and as John also mentioned, specialized policies you can set up to flag certain things as being particularly risky, requiring a special level of change control. A great example of the latter one is for our customer Cornerstone, who's asked to put all of their contract and pricing and incentive compensation related objects under specialized financial review for change control. So it wasn't just IT, it was also finance for ASC 606 compliance. And that took us 45 minutes to implement. But now those things got classified at a different risk level that had to do with their financial risk, not necessarily their technical risk, or not only their technical risk.
Excellent, that's fantastic. All right, same question being asked, or different question by the same person. If there's more than one change that impacts the same Apex class, how does it work?
If there's more than one change that impacts the same Apex class, how does it work? So, what the Strongpoint engine looks at, when you've got a change set that has more than one object in it, it looks at all of the different changes and figures out which is the most risky, right? So it's going to take the most conservative approach. So if you had 99 safe things and one dangerous thing, it's going to say that change set or that change request or that change process needs to go through for perhaps full software development lifecycle. In terms though of the actual impact analysis, it shows the impacts object by object by object. So if you go back to, Janelle was showing the impact analysis, it'll show you object by object by object what the impact is. And you can drill in, by the way, into any of these objects and see their dependencies. So if you drill into, one of the scripts, for example, and go into it, you can actually see the DRD just for that object. So that if you want to drill into it, say for example in your Apex class example, and you want to see all the things that Apex class touches, you can do that in a heartbeat. Because remember, great documentation and risk analysis isn't a good replacement for expertise and common sense of understanding what you're doing and understanding what the downstream impact might be.
Excellent. So right now we only have one more question in the queue, so please jump on the question box if you have anything else. We have a nice panel here.
I just noticed there's a few people asking, can we show more of different parts of the functionality? I can't actually see the whole question there.
Okay, I can. Can you show if we are not deploying all the fields? Do you still have to pick and choose? And can you demo more of how to use Strongpoint to identify and what actually needs to move? Or do we recommend shift click and select everything?
Oh, great. These are great. Great questions.
Can I jump in a little on?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
One of the things that, Definitely for the individual fields, you don't have to shift click. That was what I was needing to do for that scenario, and was tired of clicking checkboxes through a change request within a 25 options at a time going click, click, click. So for me, shift click was totally transformative. There's also, you can definitely individually pull components over and not pull them all. For identifying which components need to be moved over, you know, in an ideal world, who's ever's building the new feature, whether it's a declarative development or the development through coding something new, in an ideal world, there would be a list of developed components that you would reference to know what needs to go into the change request. But we all know that ideal worlds are called ideal worlds because they don't always match the real world. And so one of the things I found really helpful was the reporting that Strongpoint actually allows on metadata, so that I could see who and when metadata last changed metadata. For example, if I was building a new app in Salesforce in Sandbox and I hadn't kept a perfect list, or I just wanted to reference and make sure I didn't miss something, I could pull a report of all metadata components that were changed by me in the last 30 days in the Sandbox and get a very comprehensive view and see, oh, I forgot that I wrote that validation rule. Yes, that applies to that as well. So that was another thing that Strongpoint helped with at a few points to identify what needed to go into that.
Now, there's some other capabilities coming down. John, that was great. Some other capabilities coming down the road. And then in the next release, you'll be able to pick your objects to be included in a change request or change set by actually searching against that metadata in any environment. So you can say, for example, show me all the objects changed by Bob or Mary between date X and date Y that are these type of objects. That's one approach. The second thing is you'll be able to do it by environment comparison. Really, really useful for profiles. Environment comparison is built into this product. And again, everything we build is designed to deliver maximum ROI, because it's not that people don't go through and try to figure out what the differences are between org A and org B, but doing environment comparison in seconds, excuse me, really helps you identify what needs to move over. Now, just because it's different doesn't mean it needs to move over. But in many cases, for example, when we're getting an environment set up, we'll want to make sure at the very least that the objects, for example, in a dev environment that are relevant to our project are exactly the same. And so increased searching capability against our own metadata libraries to be able to identify those objects is coming in the next release. And the environment comparison capability already does that right now. So you can simply go in and say, I'd like to pick any objects that have changed in either environment between this date range and see what the heck they are, which is a different way of doing the reporting comparison that John was talking about, but doing it against multiple environments at the same time.
And you know, Rob, the environment comparison, there was another use case that was really helpful for understanding how far a sandbox is deviated from production. Because I know that usually each company will have some kind of staging or QA sandbox, and over time there will be things deployed to that sandbox that don't pass QA, and you know, we have to go back, oh, we're going to do it a different way. And those changes will accumulate, and it can be painful sometimes to refresh a sandbox when there's ongoing development work. But to have an understanding of how far that sandbox is deviated from production can also help with the QA process.
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly for testing. I mean, if you don't understand what the differences between your orgs are and you're doing testing, you know, this E&Y, we love those guys because they ask hard questions, right? And so E&Y said, yeah, great. How do you even know that your environment was the same in all material respects when you did that test? And one of our customers was able to go, because we did an environment comparison between the environment and all the objects as part of our prior to testing, we did that right on the change request. It's evidence, we can prove it. They flew through audit. And to give an example of the impact of this, one of our customers used to have audit, for those of you who are subject to audit, they used to have IT audits that would cost them an extraordinary amount of money and would take weeks and weeks, and their entire Salesforce team was dedicated to responding to those things. And now what they do is they send them the non-compliant change report that shows all the changes that didn't go through the normal change procedure, which is presumably not that many, and then say to the auditors, yeah, get back to us if you want to talk about it. Because the auditors have now audited them and they are very confident that Strongpoint is doing an excellent job of enforcing their own change behaviors. So using the reporting to actually reduce work. Are there any more questions? Scott? Scott, you there? Well, presuming that there's not, or that hopefully something horrible hasn't happened.
It looks like there are more questions.
Yeah, there are more.
Yeah, we've actually got a good handful more questions coming in.
Oh, good, excellent. Yeah, let's keep going there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So
all right.
Next in line, we have either, and this looks like it's to Janelle and John, have either of you used change management, i.e. approvals? If so, how has that streamlined your change management process?
So I have used it. I worked in a smaller organization than Janelle did. And so our change management was perhaps not as complex in some environments, but we would have certain levels of risk and impact that would have to go to our director to do review before deploying to production. And we would have different change management policies for deploying to, say, our QA sandbox versus our production environment. And so being able to give that different granularity for what we needed for the different environments and different levels of impact. We also had some change management policies that just required one admin to go look at, so it could be more of a second set of eyes than anything else if it was a relatively low impact. Or something that could require multiple people if it was a higher level of impact. So I know Strongpoint's got a lot of capabilities, and we use, a fairly straightforward configuration for change management approvals. But actually, one of the coolest things we did was how we tied that into our incidents in Salesforce, because we had an established incident queue when we brought Strongpoint into our environment. So we were actually able to tie them together with actually automation. I just used Process Builder to create the change requests and keep the statuses in sync so that all that information of the approval and the status would be in sync with the case, and also give that visibility back to the end user that way. So that's actually probably not the standard design of putting an approval into Strongpoint, but that worked really well for us just because we had an established process around incident management with Salesforce native cases and Service Cloud in there. So that's a little bit about how we used it. Janelle, did you have something to add?
I was just going to make a comment there, John. Thank you. The integration into your existing change process is actually very normal. You did it. You guys were fairly early to the game, and you guys did it in a custom way. A very large number of our customers, for example, already have Jira or ServiceNow or Salesforce cases that are already part of their change process, and all of the capabilities we've been talking about. Or the vast majority of them up to release and rollback behavior, including the DRDs, including the impact analysis and the risk analysis, and all that is fully integrated into Jira ServiceNow, and we're committed to rolling that out into other frameworks as well. Our objective is to make your existing process smoother, faster, safer, more complete, not get you to change your process. And so, for example, Clorox, runs ServiceNow, and most of the people who are involved in that process never look at native Strongpoint at all. They're involved in changes across things. And the other objective of doing that, of course, is to support changes that are multi-system. That you're changing, you know, for very common situation is that people are running NetSuite as an ERP and Salesforce as a their, you know, a lot of other things, CRM and other things. And if you change the pick list in one, you got to change the pick list in the other. And ServiceNow is a great environment to be doing that in, and the ability to add objects from multiple systems at the same time, or add integration objects from your iPaaS layer, extremely important. So the way you did it actually is pretty normal. It's not normal that you coded it yourself though. So Janelle, you guys, I mean, can you tell us a bit about, you know, you guys got to the point of, or your decision point for actually coming to us and joining our company was that you weren't given access to the tools, right? Can you tell us a bit about that?
So yeah, that is a part of my story. The change management process we had, even in theory from what I've seen with the approvals, would have saved me massive amounts of time. But the really, really big thing that came out of not just the change management process that Strongpoint offers, but the DRD and all the research capabilities, was the knowledge that I could say doing something that a lot of other people on my team were capable of doing, or I could try and be a part of, you know, a product that it's not just a product, this is an opportunity to me to help other people not go through the same pain points I did with change management. And change management in my previous life, is what I'm going to go ahead and call it, because I have to get used to, I don't have to do it anymore, was a long process of, one, I have to identify who I have to ask, two, I have to get their permission, and three, I have to hope they don't send me to someone else to get permission from them too. So setting up any level approvals, like what I've seen capable in Strongpoint, what I've practiced doing, would have dramatically decreased the amount of research I have to do during the change lifecycle, and turned it into building. And knowing how fast we were building, knowing how much we were able to accommodate, you know, if I say I can take out 8 to 10 hours of my week that was done in research and getting permission and turn that into building, that could have almost doubled how much we could have produced. So that was really, really frustrating to see that there's something there. Just a little bit of stats.
Yeah, so we have some stats from some existing customers. The overall impact that customers report is about a 3 to 4 times increase in productivity. It doesn't happen instantly because everybody has to get to the point where everybody actually trusts the system. But customers that have been using Strongpoint for quite some time really look back and realize how much work they're getting done because of the points that John has made, and that Janelle made as well. It's the ability to get things done that never would have gotten through the change process at all, is where most of the big time savings come from. When you actually get into development, right, you better be, if you're building something complex with lots of objects and complex coding and multiple pieces of automation, you're probably already running a really tight process. And we can make some improvement in that part by giving you better tools for migrating things and rollback and better impact analysis and better analysis early in the process. But it's all the other things, the things Janelle pointed out that never actually got to approval because they were put through the same approval process as everything else, that customers report they get the biggest bang from. And I think that makes sense from what you guys have experienced as well, Janelle and John, that it's the things that never actually ever get to see the light of day because you're too busy doing non-productive things where your productivity gain comes from. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's make sure we don't miss any other questions. Are there other questions there?
There's one final question. Are we able to move metadata field changes to a standard object and pull the profile access with it? So let me repeat. Are we able to move metadata at the field level, metadata changes to a standard object and pull the profile access with it?
So we have a data syncing. so we have data syncing capabilities for syncing data. So basically, any data you can put in a report. You define it by creating a report of the data you'd like to move, and then we can sync that data between the systems. So that's moving the data. We also have the ability to move profile changes. I'm not sure we actually move the data and the profile changes together, and that might mean I misinterpreted the question, but I'd really love to set up an offline about that. Hard questions are how we make the product better. So if we can make a note of who that was, I'd like to follow up.
The question there was about metadata of standard fields and standard objects, like moving, say, a status field on case, I think would be a standard. And can Strongpoint move that metadata? And then profile, I know is definitely yes, pulling the profile permissions through along with the metadata.
Right. So we can definitely move. We definitely move the profile and permissions. Definitely move that. I'm just thinking about the metadata, moving the metadata on standard fields, and frankly, we'll have to table that. I'm not sure if we can move the metadata on standard fields, non-custom fields.
At a high level, the answer is that Strongpoint can move anything that Salesforce allows to be moved in the API. That does include a little bit more than can be moved in change sets. I found a few things, but there are still a few metadata configurations that have to be done. And I don't know offhand, can't give a list of what all they are, but that's a great question to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Excellent.
As a CEO,
excellent. Well,
nothing makes me smile more than when my customer knows more about some of the things the product can do than I know. So thanks, John. You just made my day. So
that's great. So everyone, I know we're a little past the time. We're over the hour. I want to conclude this webinar. It was hopefully very valuable to everyone. I would like to thank the panelists, especially John Knight and Mark Walker, for jumping on as well. And John, I definitely want to thank you for doing the comparison, which demonstrated and revealed that 27x deployment improvement. This is something we really wanted to share with everyone because it was a real world example of how we can put our efforts in a better direction. Strongpoint would also like to thank all who attended. We hope you found this valuable, and we look forward to hearing from you. You will receive an email from us with the recorded webinar. And as I mentioned, this is the first of a series of webinars Strongpoint will be offering throughout the year. So please keep your eyes open for the next invite. This concludes the webinar. Thanks again, and please have a great day. See you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.